As I mentioned at the start of the service, we've come to the end of the season of Epiphany. For the past 5 weeks, we've immersed ourselves in the stories and pondered the revelation that is Jesus, his baptism in the Jordan by John, the calling of the disciples, the casting out of demons, and the teaching with authority, startling authority. And next week, we move into the season of Lent, the journey that we take with Jesus to Jerusalem and to the cross. Each year, as the season of Epiphany draws to a close, we hear a reading about the Transfiguration of Jesus, this mysterious event that occurs on the top of a mountain. There are other stories in the Bible that include mountains: Moses and the 10 Commandments, Elijah defeating the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the still small voice. Jesus and the woman at the well discuss which mountain to worship God on. It doesn't happen on the mountain, but they're talking about mountain as the place to be closer to God. The Sermon on the Mount, of course, and many more. Mountains in the Bible mean something important is happening. We still talk about mountaintop experiences, meaning something wonderful or amazing has happened, something life-changing, something remarkable and out of the ordinary. That the Transfiguration happened on a mountain, then, is not surprising. We hear from Mark that Jesus hauls Peter, James, and John up a mountain to pray. As we watch the trio ascend, we think about that earlier climb when Moses went up Mount Sinai to talk to God. There was glory shining all around in that story too. Lightning, thunder, clouds. When Moses came down, his face, we were told, was aflame with God's brilliance. And he was lugging those big stone tablets. In the story from Mark, today, Jesus lights up with that same brilliance. Just like back then, God also speaks from a cloud. This is my chosen son. Listen to him. God issues a commandment in this story. This is an echo too from the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan, the story that we began our season of Epiphany with. When we also hear of a voice speaking from heaven, that time the voice seemed to be speaking to Jesus as he came up from the water. "You are my own dear son, with whom I am well pleased," said that voice. This time the voice seems to be speaking to the others around. It's an amazing scene. The disciples are overcome with what many translations call the fear of the Lord. Then Peter blurts out his desire to set up 3 tents there to capture the experience. He wants to stay, but the glory dissipates almost as fast as it had gathered. And Jesus doesn't want to linger. He gets the disciples up off their faces and onto their feet, and they all trudge back down the mountain, back to real life. And Jesus instructs them not to tell anyone what happened just yet. Now, the story of the Transfiguration is recorded in 3 of the Gospels. It tells something of a dramatic happening, an actual mountaintop experience in every sense of that phrase, happening to those 3 disciples that day. In Mark's version, the Transfiguration happens just after the midpoint of his whole gospel narrative. The first half of his gospel closes with the miracle of the loaves and fishes, after which Jesus asks his disciples, "Do you not yet understand? Do you have eyes and fail to see still?" Mark then, perhaps not surprisingly, begins the second half of his gospel with the story of Jesus healing the blind man. After which Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do you say that I am? Who do people say that I am?" Right after this discussion, Jesus starts to tell the disciples about his impending death and resurrection. And once again, the theme in Mark, one of the themes in Mark, the disciples fail to understand what he's talking about. They fail to really see. Even when he gets right down to it and says, if you want to become my followers, you must deny yourselves, take up your cross, and follow me. For Mark, the focus is clearly on discipleship and what it takes to follow in Jesus' way. Now, it's right after this, well, 6 days after, actually, according to Mark, that Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up this mountain. And especially within Mark's way of telling the story, it can be easy to focus on that imperative that comes through so clearly. The don't linger on the mountain, it's just a quick rest stop before getting back on the highway and getting back to the work of discipleship. And yes, the story does offer up that valid question: when God realities break into our lives, what is our response? What are we to do? Do we deny ourselves? Are we, as Christ's followers, able to claim Jesus and align ourselves spiritually and politically with him, regardless of the cost? Yet, still, for the disciples, the experience on the mountain was truly an epiphany, a revelation and a sign for them of Jesus' oneness with God, his alignment and his spiritual connection to those ancient prophets of old, those prophets of Israel. And yes, it's plain from the text that Jesus didn't want his friends to put up those tents. Yes, Peter was befuddled by the strange experience and probably wasn't thinking all that clearly when he blurted out, "It's good for us to be here." Yes, Jesus took them right back down, and they plunged back into the hard work of healing and teaching and making that journey to Jerusalem. And there's no question that engagement with the world, part of our progressive faith, is an essential part of discipleship that requires courage and determination. But a colleague of mine asked a good question of this text the other day. Why would Jesus show his friends and the unimaginable glory of God radiating through him on the top of that mountain and not mean for them also to enjoy it? There have been times over the years, many times actually, when my preaching on this text has focused on take the mountaintop experiences you are granted and then don't delay, get down that mountain, back to the hard realities of life, get to work as disciples, healing and feeding and binding up and tending. And yes, as followers, we're called to that work. But it's also okay to take time to sit in awe and remember that we are called and gathered for praise, thanksgiving, and freedom. That we're called for visions, for dreaming, for enjoying the moment when we, the ordinary, are transfigured and can glimpse the true sacred nature of all reality. And that really only is possible when we take that time on the mountain. And what the disciples received that day on the mountain, I wouldn't say it was that gallon of emergency gas or a quick breather for the work crew, coffee break. It was pure gift. They were given a glimpse of the richest and most fundamental truth about our lives. And they were meant to react to it in precisely the way that they did, with awe. And just because it wasn't time for them to enjoy it permanently doesn't mean that they were wrong to want to stay in that moment, to have it permanently. In moments when God's glory breaks through our world of fact, rational thought, in times when we received this gift of being transported to the real world, the world behind the veil, the one Jesus called the kingdom, the one full of justice and reconciliation, love and glory. In moments, as someone more eloquent than I put it, when the dazzle of God's love squeezes through the fissures in our denial and our defenses and explodes into our lives. And we're drawn inexorably to God like people who've been living sun-starved for years in caves. We too want to pitch tents on that mountain. We want to stay. And yes, it turns out that we cannot stay. But the reason we cannot stay isn't because it isn't good for us to be on that summit, in that full awareness of the reality of God's glory, because to want to stay with that is to want God, to want to be in and dwell in God. But it's also true that we're called as disciples to allow ourselves to be vessels for the Spirit, agents of transformation of the world until the fully realized kingdom, which is both here, sometimes behind that veil, and is still coming to be fully realized. But what we can sometimes miss in this story is the reminder that the work of the people of faith is what we might describe as more wonder than competence. More wonder than competence, more surrender than skill, more gratitude and praise than planning and programming. That can be a hard one sometimes for us to truly embrace. The call to discipleship being not to save the world, we can leave that up to the larger love and power that holds us and of which we are a part, but rather to witness in word and deed and in odd silence at times to the fact that God is, in fact, saving and recreating everything, even now. Our calling is to become increasingly alert to the places where transformation has already begun. Resurrection is already in its stages of the becoming. And to point those places and those activities out, tell the truth about what we see, name them. Our main calling is therefore to develop our capacity to see beyond that common sense realm, to see beyond ordinary sight, to see the world suffering exactly as it is, and to see God's resurrecting activity already right in the middle of it all. And this means learning to take time on the mountain, to pray, to contemplate, to refocus the eyes of the heart by gazing on God and on that glory when it reaches us, and touches us. The theologian and spiritual author, Father Richard Rohr, says, "When we see contemplatively, we know we live in a sacramental universe where everything is a pointer and an epiphany. If we can see with the eyes of prayer, there are signs of God's redemptive activity all around us in nature and in the actions of so many people and followers around us." For what is transfiguration, if not the moment when we are able to see with crystal clarity the full reality of the divine manifesting in and through ordinary people and ordinary processes, and hear with crystal clarity the divine song being sung by each of God's creatures. Today, in the story of Jesus' transfiguration, the disciples up on that mountain with Jesus end up seeing with absolute clarity confirmation of the divine at work and in and through an ordinary, fully human being, the person of Jesus. And in our day, in our days, We can, if we do take time to look prayerfully and contemplatively, we can see the divine at work in extraordinary ways in and through ordinary people and processes around us. I want to offer you two quick examples that I came across this week where I see God at work in ordinary people. First one is in the work of two architects. Their names are Ronald Rael and Virginia San Fratello, along with artists and part of an artist collective in California. They managed to build several pink seesaws. This is a project they came up with, to build several pink seesaws between the posts in a section of the border wall between Mexico and the US. Apparently, it took 10 years of planning to pull this off, but they did it. It's called the Teeter-Totter Wall, and it was praised for encouraging new and creative forms of human connection. It even received a prize for standing as what they called a poignant reminder of how human beings can transcend the forces that seek to divide us. Second example, a ordinary man named David Millarch. He is an arborist, and he is engaged, apparently, in what he calls a spiritual quest to save California's coastal redwoods, the giant redwoods in California. He talks about all the carbon that these giant redwoods are able to pull out of the air. And he believes that these trees are one of the world's best chances to fight climate change. And apparently they are 96% disappeared from their former population. So he's founded an organization called Archangel Ancient Tree. And that organization, with him heading it up, is now in the process of cloning. I think their goal is 1 million old redwoods, cloning 1 million redwoods through the sprouts and the shoots that come up out of the stumps when the trees are cut down. And then they are fostering them right now, planting some of them in Southern Oregon, apparently, but eventually want to send them all around the world to be planted in places where they hopefully won't be threatened, in safe places. Just quite extraordinary. And so our Epiphany journey ends with a reminder today that seeing with the eyes of faith and prayer and wonder before building tents and following Jesus into the fray of truth-telling and justice making, as important as that is, that those practices help us see the world aflame with God's light, already manifesting in glory all around us. And that realization, that awareness will sustain us and will transform us for the work that we are then called to do. Christian writer G.K. Chesterton once wrote, "A religion is not the church we go to, but the cosmos we live in." And so the practice of prayer, of contemplation, is really a practice of deep seeing, whether on the mountaintop or elsewhere, of nurturing our ability to see and know with clarity all of creation and each other as both the hiding place, I love this phrase he uses, the hiding place and the revelation place for God. And that is the spiritual practice we are called to as people of faith. And I pray that that is where we will choose to begin our Lenten journey. Lent begins next week, 40 days leading up to the celebration of Easter. And I pray that we may begin that journey with prayer and reflection, with seeing things as they really are, and letting that deep seeing lead us then to action and service. A final anecdote. In the late 4th century, in the Syrian desert, a young monk named Lot went out from his cave to consult an older, wiser monk whose name was Joseph. Lot said to Joseph, Abba, the best I can, I say my prayers, I fast, I meditate, and I serve my neighbor. What else is there to do? The old man stood up, stretched his hands towards heaven. His fingers became like 10 lamps of fire. And he said, to do? Nothing more. But you could become all flame. Maybe, just maybe, we are meant for transfiguration too. Maybe, just maybe, our most important calling is to allow our hearts and souls to become aflame with wonder, prayer, and praise for this glory-infused world, our glory-infused lives, and the pulse of love at the heart of it all. It would be good, it would be very good for us to be there. Amen.